Welcome to Anana's creation. Today, we begin the epic story of the Divine Twins, a saga of rivalry, survival, and the profound duality of light and darkness. This is the story of Apollo and Artemis, but their legend does not begin with their birth. It begins, as so many tragedies do, with betrayal, jealousy, and the terrible, binding power of an oath made in rage. Before the twins drew breath, there was Mount Olympus, the executive suite of the cosmos. It was a place of blinding architecture, infinite luxury, and politics so dangerous they made mortal kingdoms look like playground squabbles. Presiding over it all was Zeus, king of the gods, a ruler defined by absolute power, the roar of the thunderbolt, and an impulsive heart that he refused to govern. And beside him sat his wife, the queen, Hera. Hera was not a goddess to be trifled with. She was the architect of society, the protector of marriage, the very definition of cosmic law and order. And she was perpetually humiliated. Zeus's affairs were not quiet indiscretions. They were tectonic events that shattered dynasties and created monsters. Hera endured, channeling her fury not usually at the husband she could not truly punish, but at the women who caught his eye, and the children they produced. Her newest target was different. She was not a fleeting mortal queen or a minor forest nymph. She was Leto. Leto was of the old blood, a Titaness, daughter of Titans, yet defined by a gentleness that seemed almost alien on the marble battlefield of Olympus. She moved with quiet grace, the personification of modesty and kindness, a calm shadow in a world of blinding egos. It was perhaps this very tranquility that drew Zeus, a chaotic storm seeking a moment of peace. Their affair was inevitable, a clash of thunder and quiet shadow. And like all things Zeus touched, it bore fruit. When the rumors reached Hera's throne, they were whispers. But when the truth became undeniable, that Leto was pregnant, the whispers on Olympus ceased, replaced by a terrible waiting silence. Hera did not rage, not at first. She did not throw furniture or command legions. She waited, her anger cooling, hardening, sharpening itself into a weapon. The realization that Leto carried twins, both destined for greatness, both carrying the undiluted power of Zeus, was the final breaking point. This was not just an insult, it was a threat to her legacy, a challenge to the supremacy of her own divine children. Hera ascended her throne, the air around her crackling with ozone and spite. She raised her hand, not just as a queen, but as the goddess who governed the very stability of the physical world. She spoke, and the cosmos listened. She swore an oath, binding heaven and earth, and the oath was aimed directly at the unborn children and the mother who carried them. She cursed Leto. But this was no simple hex. It was a masterpiece of legalistic cruelty. "Hear me, Earth," Hera decreed, her voice echoing across every continent and ocean. "Let the woman Leto find no resting place. Let no land that rests upon the solid foundations of the world, no ground that sees the light of Helios' sun, grant her refuge. She will wander, and she will never, ever stop. She will bear those children nowhere." The curse settled over the planet like a shroud. Every kingdom, every island fixed to the ocean floor, every mountain range, and every quiet valley was now bound by Hera's divine restraining order. Leto was instantly, completely exiled. Cast from the gleaming gates of Olympus, Leto began her desperate search. She was heavy with the twins, her body aching, her divinity stressed to the breaking point. She went first to Arcadia, a land of deep forests and ancient magic. The land itself recoiled. The trees bent away from her, the soil refused to support her feet. The spirits of the place whispered, "We cannot." The queen sees. She tried Thessaly, the land of mountains. The peaks seemed to grow steeper, the passes closing with sudden rock slides. She went to the islands of the Aegean, one by one. Aegina, Euboea, Crete. The rulers, both mortal and immortal, took one look at the desperate, pregnant Titaness and slammed their gates. They feared Hera more than they pitied Leto. To offer her a cup of water, to offer her shade for an hour, would mean inviting the wrath of the queen of the gods, a wrath that brought plagues, droughts, and monsters. Leto was toxic. She was celestial radiation, a walking catastrophe, and no one would risk contamination. As her time drew near, the agony intensified. The twins within her were divine, energetic, and desperate to be born, kicking against the walls of a prison that had no exit. Leto was exhausted, starved, and hunted. Because Hera was not content with a passive curse. She wanted to ensure Leto's destruction. From the darkest fissure in the earth, from the primal mud of the world's creation, Hera summoned the python. This was not merely a snake. It was a dragon of immense size, scaled in ancient obsidian and dripping venom that sizzled the ground it crossed. The python was older than many of the gods, an earth entity that loathed the Olympian order. Hera gave it one command: find Leto. devour her and the children she carries. The hunt began. Now, Leto did not just wander against geography, she fled a physical pursuer. She could hear the python miles away, the crushing of entire forests as it tracked her divine scent. She hid in dark caves, only to realize the curse held. The cave was part of the mainland, part of the earth beneath the sun. She tried to wade into the sea, but the waves, obeying Hera, pushed her back to the shore. Every hand was turned against her. Every god looked away. Zeus, the source of her agony, offered no help. He was trapped by Hera's politics, or perhaps he had already moved on, the consequences of his actions an inconvenience he preferred to ignore. Leto was utterly alone, adrift in a world that had been commanded to reject her, hunted by a nightmare, and carrying two gods desperate for life. She was at the edge of the world, the labor pains beginning to rack her body, the shadow of the python closing in behind her. There was nowhere left to go. The curse was absolute. No land on earth would take her. Leto had reached the end of the world. She collapsed on a desolate stretch of coastline, the salt spray mixing with her tears, her body seized by the first true convulsions of childbirth. The twins inside her were gods, and they demanded release. Behind her, in the hills of the mainland, she heard the terrifying hiss of the python, a sound like mountains grinding together. The serpent was toying with her, but it was closing the distance. She was trapped between the unholy monster and the unforgiving sea. Hera's curse was perfect. Every solid inch of the planet was forbidden. She screamed, not at the gods, but at the ocean itself, pleading for an end. And the ocean answered. A voice, deeper than earthquakes and older than memory, rose from the depths. It was Poseidon, lord of the oceans, the Earthshaker. He was Zeus's brother, unbound by most of Hera's laws, as his domain was the shifting water, not the stable land. He felt a rare moment of pity for the Titaness, or perhaps, he felt a strategic obligation to ensure the birth of two powerful allies against Hera's tyranny. Your curse forbids any land fixed beneath the sun, Poseidon's voice echoed in her mind, sounding like the crash of distant surf. The queen was specific. But she forgot about the land that is not fixed. She forgot the debris of the old wars. She forgot your sister. Leto looked up, confused. Poseidon struck the water with his massive trident. The sea churned, and rising from the fog, tossed violently on the waves, was a jagged piece of rock. It was not an island, it was a scar. A desolate, floating stone, barren of all life save a single, struggling palm tree and a few patches of moss. This was Ortygia, the Quail Island. But it was known by another name, Delos. And it had a consciousness. Delos was, in truth, Asteria, Leto's own sister. Asteria, too, had been pursued by Zeus. To escape him, she had thrown herself into the Aegean, transforming into this floating rock, preferring oblivion to the fate Leto now suffered. It had drifted for centuries, aimless and barren, despised by sailors as a hazard and by the gods as a failure. Leto waded into the freezing water, swimming toward the desperate, floating refuge. As she drew closer, she felt the misery of the rock, the consciousness of her sister trapped within. "Sister," Leto gasped, clinging to the wet stone. "Help me, please. I am hunted. The curse allows you." The island was afraid. It was nothing. It had no power. To defy Hera meant annihilation. "They call you barren," Leto promised, the labor pains shaking her voice. "They call you useless driftwood. Grant me sanctuary. Let my children be born here, and I swear to you, from this day forward, you will be the richest land in the world. Men will build temples of gold to honor you. Pilgrims will cross the world to stand where you stand. You will be anchored in light, and you will never be barren again. You will be the center of the world." It was a bargain between the desperate and the forgotten. The island of Delos agreed. As Leto dragged herself onto the shore of the floating rock, the python arrived at the mainland coast, roaring in fury as it saw its prey escape. The serpent plunged into the water, its massive coils churning the sea into a vortex. But Poseidon intervened. The Earthshaker slammed his trident on the seabed, and 4 massive pillars of diamond and coral erupted from the depths, driving through the bottom of Delos and anchoring it, for the first time, to the center of the earth. The python lunged, but Poseidon raised a wave higher than mountains, a solid wall of churning, dark water that crashed down around the newly fixed island, hiding it in a blinding tempest. The python, confused by the shifting tides and blocked by the divine storm, could only rage in the waters, temporarily blinded to its prey's location. Leto was safe, but the ordeal was far from over. Hera, watching from Olympus, realized she had been tricked. She had been defeated by a loophole. Furious, she enacted her final revenge. Leto lay on the rocky ground, clinging to the lone palm tree, ready to give birth. Yet, nothing happened. The labor continued, agonizing, blinding, splitting her body, but the children would not come. 1 day passed. Then 3. Then 9 days and 9 nights of unrelenting, agonizing, fruitless labor. Hera had blocked the birth. She had found Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, and commanded her to remain on Olympus. Without Eileithyia's presence to open the way, no birth, not even a divine one, could be completed. Hera held her there, some stories say by simply keeping her seated with her legs and fingers crossed, a symbolic binding that kept Leto's womb magically sealed. The other goddesses on Olympus, Rhea, Thetis, and Amphitrite, watched in horror. This was no longer justice, it was torture. They pooled their resources. They summoned Iris, the messenger goddess of the rainbow, and gave her a bribe magnificent enough to defy the queen, a necklace of woven gold and amber, 9 yards long. Iris descended the rainbow bridge, swift and silent, finding Eileithyia held captive in Hera's palace. She offered the bribe. Eileithyia, greedy for the exquisite jewelry and perhaps harboring her own pity for Leto, agreed. She wrapped herself in mist, slipping past Hera's watch, and descended to the storm-racked island of Delos. The moment Eileithyia stepped onto the rock, the spell broke. Leto screamed, a sound that split the sky. She bore down, and the first twin was born. It was a daughter. She was born fully formed, bright-eyed, and radiating a pale, silver light. She was Artemis. There was no time for rest, no time for congratulations. Artemis, born only moments before, stood up. She was coated in the ichor of the gods, yet her eyes were clear and terrifyingly ancient. She saw her mother, shattered by 9 days of torment. She felt the presence of the python still circling the barrier reef. And she knew, with the instinct of a predator, that her brother, Apollo, was still trapped, and that her mother lacked the strength to finish the birth. Artemis, the newborn goddess, wiped the sweat from Leto's brow, took her mother's hand, and turned to the impossible task. The very first act of the goddess of the hunt, the virgin protector of the wild, was to serve as the midwife for the birth of her own twin brother. The ordeal was only half over. The island of Delos hung suspended between a divine tempest and the primal rage of the python. Leto was fading, her life force shredded by 9 days of obstructed labor. But Artemis was there. Minutes old, eyes shining with the cold silver light of a distant star, the newborn goddess acted with terrifying, instinctual competence. She was the protector, the midwife, the first witness. She held her mother's hand, channeling her own nascent divinity, bracing Leto for the final, impossible surge. The birth of Artemis had been the breaking of the dam. The birth of her brother was the flood. This was not a birth, it was an explosion. Apollo tore himself from the womb not with the cry of an infant, but with a roar of pure, golden light. A physical detonation of energy radiated from him, so bright and so absolute that it vaporized Poseidon's protective storm clouds. The sky, dark and raging moments before, was instantly scoured clean, revealing a piercing blue zenith. The golden shockwave of his birth radiated outward, hitting the raging waters and silencing them, pushing the circling python back with a force of pure, searing heat. This was the god of the sun, and his arrival was the new dawn. The prophecy Leto made to Delos was instantly fulfilled. The moment Apollo's light touched the barren rock, the island changed. The gray stone, stained by salt and sea scum, flushed with warmth and color. Golden flowers, crocuses, hyacinths, and bright marigolds burst from the bare stone, carpeting the island in seconds. The single, skeletal palm tree that Leto clung to erupted in fresh, green fronds and heavy clusters of dates. The air, which had smelled only of sulfur and the reptile stench of the python, was now overwhelmed with the scent of nectar and spring blooms. And from the heavens, 7 great white swans descended, circling the transformed island 7 times, singing a song so beautiful that the ocean itself stopped moving to listen. Delos, the floating slag heap, the forgotten rock, was now the most radiant, sacred, and famous island in the cosmos. Leto, weeping with relief and exhaustion, held her children. But they were not babies. Within minutes of their birth, nourished by the divine energy of their arrival, Artemis and Apollo looked like young children, bright-eyed, aware, and vibrating with power. Several goddesses, including Themis, the Titan goddess of divine law and order, now dared to descend to the island, Hera's curse having been officially broken. They brought water to wash the twins and wrapped them not in swaddling, but in shining white tunics. Then, Themis took a small portion of nectar, the drink of the gods, and ambrosia, their food, and placed it on Apollo's lips. The effect was instantaneous. The divine food catalyzed his power. Apollo stood up, the white bands wrapping him snapping away as if they were dry threads. He was no longer a child, he was the god, perfected and potent. He looked at the sky, at the sea, and at his weary mother. Then he spoke, his voice the sound of a perfectly tuned instrument, a declaration of identity that echoed across the heavens, all the way to the halls of Olympus. "The golden lyre shall be my companion," he declared. "The curved composite bow shall be my deepest pleasure, and I will use both to reveal to mortals the infallible, unwavering will of my father, Zeus." He was the god of music and art. He was the god of the archer. And he was the god of prophecy. He was order, harmony, and truth, born into a world of chaos that had tried to murder him before he could breathe. Artemis stood beside him. She said nothing. She did not need to. She simply picked up a fallen frond from the palm tree, testing its weight. She was the silver light. He was the golden. She was the silence of the hunt. He was the sound of the lyre. She was the moon. He was the sun. They were perfect opposites, and in this first moment, they were perfectly united. They had shared the womb, they had shared the terror of the python, and they shared the trauma of their mother's suffering. A shadow passed over the brilliant sunlight. The celebration ceased. While the island itself was now sacred ground, the python was still there. The monster, ancient and vast, was circling the perimeter of Delos, blocked by Apollo's radiant light but trapping them nonetheless. It was an earth-born titan of chaos, and it recognized its antithesis. Apollo was not just the child it had been sent to kill. He was the definition of the new Olympian order that the python despised. Apollo looked at the murky shadow moving beneath the waves. He looked at his mother, asleep now, but her face still etched with the memory of her 9-day torment. He looked at his sister, whose silver eyes reflected his own golden fury. Hera's curse may have been broken by a loophole, but her monster remained. Apollo, the god of harmony, felt his first surge of divine rage. He was the god of order, and that thing was the embodiment of the primal chaos that had tormented his family. His destiny was clear. His declaration had been made, but his first act could not be music. His first act must be war. Before he could build a temple, before he could sing a song, he had to cleanse the world of the creature that had hunted him in the dark. He needed weapons. He needed the bow he had just claimed as his own. And he knew exactly where the monster's lair was. The python's home base, the center of the Earth's corruption, was a place called Delphi. The island of Delos was now a paradise, a jewel of golden flowers and radiant light anchored in the center of the sea. But it was also a golden cage. Beyond the shore, in the deep water, the python continued its patrol. The monster was massive, an ancient titan of scales and venom, and it waited. It had been thwarted by Apollo's birthlight and Poseidon's barrier, but it did not leave. It knew its mission from Hera was incomplete as long as the twins and their mother lived. On the island, the twins grew. Divine maturation defies mortal time. They were not infants for long. In 4 days, they possessed the bodies and minds of young adults, perfectly formed, brimming with a power that shook the very ground they walked on. Artemis, silent and graceful, explored every inch of her island sanctuary, her eyes already scanning the horizon, identifying the habits of the seabirds, her instincts honing. Apollo tuned his senses, hearing the music of the spheres, feeling the vibration of the earth, but all his focus was drawn north, toward the mainland, where the echo of the monster's presence felt like a discordant note in the symphony of the cosmos. They were gods, but they were unarmed. They had divine will, but no vector to enforce it. On Olympus, Zeus watched. His silence during Leto's torment had been a calculated political necessity, a concession to his furious wife. But the game had changed. His children were born. They had survived. They were no longer theoretical heirs. They were facts, brilliant and powerful. And they were trapped by an agent of chaos sent by his own queen. This chaos insulted the very order Zeus had fought the Titans to establish. It was time for the king of the gods to choose a side, and he always chose power. Zeus did not descend himself. Instead, his voice cracked the heavens, a bolt of thunder carrying a command that dove deep into the earth, striking the fiery heart of the volcanic mountain, Etna. He summoned Hephaestus, the master craftsman, the god of the forge. Hephaestus was the rejected son, lame, hard-working, and perpetually unimpressed by the glittering arrogance of his Olympian relatives. He was the son of Hera, who had once, in disgust at his imperfection, thrown him from the mountain. Hephaestus felt no loyalty to his mother's petty vendettas, but he lived for the challenge of creation. An order from Zeus to arm 2 brand new gods, children Hera had actively tried to destroy, was the kind of work Hephaestus savored. Deep beneath the earth, his forge roared to life. His assistants, the elder Cyclopes, Brontes, the Thunderer, and Steropes, the Lightning Maker, stoked the fires with bellows the size of houses. Hephaestus analyzed the task. These were not average deities. They were twins of duality. They needed paired weapons, equal in power, opposite in essence. For Apollo, he began work on Crusaor, the golden bow. He commanded the Cyclopes to draw down a physical beam of the midday sun, molten and blinding, and hammered it upon his anvil. The concussion of his hammer shook the Mediterranean. He twisted the light, quenching it not in water, but in the pure sound of the first musical note. He forged a quiver of matching gold, and then he created the arrows. They were not simple shafts, they were crystallized sunbeams. Some were designed to deliver the swift, burning agony of the plague, others to deliver a merciful, sudden death, and all of them were enchanted to fly with infallible accuracy. Then, for Artemis, he crafted Argyrotoxos, the silver bow. Hephaestus did not use the sun. He waited until the moon was full and captured a pure beam of its coldest light. He hammered the moonlight, which fought against the heat, solidifying into a bow of impossible, shining silver. He quenched this bow not in sound, but in the dew collected from a pristine, untouched forest. Her arrows were slivers of the new moon, silent, deadly, and designed to strike without warning. They were the arrows of the sudden hunt, the arrows that protected the young, and the arrows that brought the swift, cold release of death to women in agony. The work was done. The forge fell silent. Hephaestus called for Hermes, the messenger god, the only deity fast enough to run the Python's blockade. Back on Delos, the twins stood on the shore, watching the dark shape in the water. Suddenly, the air crackled. Hermes arrived in a blur of winged sandals, the stench of ozone radiating from him. He carried the 2 bows and the 2 quivers. He offered the golden bow to Apollo and the silver bow to Artemis. The moment Apollo touched the golden grip, the bow erupted in light, humming with the sound of a lyre string. He drew the bow back, the string was light itself. When Artemis took the silver bow, the air around her chilled, and the scent of the deep woods, of pine and wet earth, rose from the weapon. They did not need training. The knowledge was born in them. Apollo looked at Artemis. They were the hunted no longer. They were the hunters. Artemis looked toward the mainland, toward the dark forest she had never seen but knew was her domain. She made her vow not to her father, but to the sky and to herself. She would be the eternal maiden, the protector of the wild, the mistress of the hunt, and no one, god or mortal, would ever claim her. Apollo turned north, his golden eyes fixed on the distant mountains of the mainland. He could feel the Python, and beyond it, he could feel the center of the earth, a place called Parnassus. The monster had an ancient lair there, a place of dark fumes and corrupted prophecies. He raised his golden bow, the first arrow of pure sunlight already knocked. His mother was safe. Now, vengeance would be exacted. Order would be established. He would hunt the beast that had hunted him and claim its lair as his own. The twins, armed and divine, prepared to leave their sanctuary. The hunt was about to begin. The golden cage of Delos, having served its purpose, was now a sanctuary, but it was not a home. Leto, now safe and revered as the mother of gods, would remain there, forever honored. But her children were forces of nature, and they could not be contained. Their brief reunion as an armed family was over. Their separate destinies were calling. Artemis was the first to depart. The wild was calling her. The forests of Arcadia, the snow-capped peaks of Taygetus, the whispering reeds of the rivers, these were her cathedrals, and they lacked their mistress. She did not need a path or a chariot. She looked toward the mainland, embraced her mother, and gave her twin brother a single, knowing glance. They were opposites, forever bound by the trauma of their birth, yet destined to rule separate kingdoms. Artemis stepped into a shadow and vanished, dissolving into a silent ray of moonlight, reappearing hundreds of miles away in the pristine wilderness she now claimed as her own. Apollo watched her go. His departure would not be silent. He was the god of light, harmony, and public declaration. He picked up his golden bow and his lyre. He, too, embraced his mother, promising that her tormentor would pay a final price, and that the world would know order. He did not vanish. He rose into the air, a comet of unbearable golden light, leaving Delos behind. He flew across the Aegean, a streak of pure sunlight. Where his light passed, the sea, long fouled by the Python's presence, seemed to boil clean. He crossed onto the mainland of Greece. The journey was swift, drawn by an invisible thread of destiny, a magnetic pull toward the darkness he was born to destroy. He was heading for the slopes of Mount Parnassus. As he drew closer, the world changed. The vibrant green of the lowlands faded, replaced by gray, sickly rock. The air grew thick, the sunlight struggling to pierce a persistent, sulfurous fog that clung to the mountainside. This was the Python's domain. The monster's venom, its very breath, was a miasma, a physical manifestation of pollution and chaos, that poisoned the land for miles around its lair. This place was called Pytho, named for the serpent that ruled it. It was, the ancients believed, the literal center of the world, the omphalos, the navel of the earth. A massive stone sat there, marking the spot where the world began. But this sacred center had been corrupted. Before the Olympians, this was the territory of Gaia, the Earth Mother herself. The oracle here was the oldest on the planet. A deep chasm split the rock, venting fumes from the planet's core, fumes that could induce visions. Gaia had set her child, the Python, as the original guardian of this sacred, chaotic magic. But the guardian had become a tyrant. The Python, ancient and filled with chthonic rage, despised the new order of the Olympians, the gods of the sky. It had festered here for eons, hoarding the magic of the earth, terrorizing the local mortals who dared approach, demanding sacrifices to appease its bottomless hunger. This was what Apollo had been hunting. This was not just a snake. It was the physical manifestation of the ancient, primal chaos that had tried to prevent his birth, the very antithesis of his existence. He was the god of clarity, reason, medicine, and harmony. The Python was the god of delirium, rot, poison, and discord. This was not just revenge for his mother. This was a cosmic realignment. Apollo landed at the edge of the valley. He stood, a single point of blinding gold in a world of oppressive gray. The sulfurous fog recoiled from him, sizzling where it touched his divine light. The silence here was heavy, broken only by the drip of poisoned water and the distant hiss that seemed to come from the rock itself. He saw the chasm, the source of the rot. He drew his golden bow. He did not knock an arrow, not yet. Instead, he drew back the string, made of pure light, and plucked it. A single, perfect musical note erupted from the bowstring, sharp and pure as a diamond. The note tore through the valley, a sound of absolute order. It was a challenge. It was the announcement that the new order had arrived. The earth answered with a tremor. The ground shook, and the hissing intensified, echoing from the depths of the chasm. From the black fissure, the Python emerged. This was no mere serpent. This was a geographic catastrophe. Its scales were plates of obsidian and diseased rock, its eyes milky with the poison of ages. Its coils were thicker than the trunks of ancient forests, digging trenches in the earth as it moved. It rose from the chasm, its head blotting out the weak sun, its body seeming to have no end. It was the earth itself, roused to anger. It tasted the air and smelled the god, the infant from Delos, the child of the prophecy, the Olympian usurper, now grown, armed, and invading its most sacred territory. The Python reared back, its massive jaws unhinged, revealing fangs that dripped a black venom so potent that it melted the stone where it struck. It did not recognize Apollo as a god to be worshipped. It recognized him as the prey that had escaped. With a roar that cracked the mountainside and sent avalanches of poisoned rock tumbling into the valley, the monster lunged. Apollo, unwavering, raised the golden bow, the first arrow forged of a pure sunbeam already glowing against the string, knowing this was the battle he was born to fight. The battle for the center of the world had begun. The Python lunged, a mountain of primal rage moving with impossible speed. Its jaws unhinged, aiming to swallow the new god whole, a wave of black, stone-melting venom sprang ahead of it. But Apollo was not there. He was the god of light, and he moved with the speed of a sunbeam. He dodged the spray, the venom sizzling on the rocks where he had stood a microsecond before. While still in the air, he drew his golden bow. The bowstring, woven from light, sang a high, perfect C-sharp. He released. The arrow, a crystallized ray of the midday sun, crossed the valley. It did not fly like a physical object. It simply ceased to be at the bow and appeared at the target. It struck the Python's obsidian hide, not with a thud, but with a detonation. It was a localized sunrise, an explosion of pure, searing heat that melted the ancient scales and vaporized the flesh beneath, punching a smoking, cauterized hole deep into the monster's flank. The Python roared, a sound that shook the foundation of Parnassus. The valley fractured. This was the first true pain the creature had felt in millennia. This was not the sting of a mortal spear. This was its elemental opposite. But the Python was the earth. It was ancient, and it was vast. The wound, horrific as it was, only served to focus its rage. It thrashed, its massive coils leveling the remaining diseased forests, slamming the mountainside in a percussion of earthquakes, attempting to bury the god in an avalanche of rock. Apollo danced away, his feet barely touching the ground as the world broke apart around him. The monster realized it could not catch him. So, it used its true weapon. The Python plunged its head back into the chasm and drew a deep breath. It exhaled, not venom, but the chasm itself. The miasma. The pure, toxic, psychedelic fumes of the Earth's core, the gas that induced the oracle's visions, rolled across the valley. This was not just poison, it was madness. It was a wave of terror, confusion, and despair. The fumes carried the echo of his mother's 9 days of agony, the feeling of being hunted in the dark, the crushing weight of Hera's hatred. The gas was designed to break the mind of any god or mortal who inhaled it. But Apollo was not just any god. He was the god of reason, clarity, and medicine. As the rolling wave of delirium hit him, his own divine light flared, creating a golden aura, a shield of pure order that vaporized the chaotic fumes. He was the antidote. The python rose again, shocked that its ultimate defense had failed. And it saw Apollo. He was standing on a high ledge, his golden bow raised. He was no longer dodging. He was the predator. "You are the rot," Apollo's voice rang out, the first sound of harmony in this valley of discord. "You are the chaos that hunts in the dark. I am the light, I am the order, and I am the cleansing." He fired again, and again, and again. He became a conduit for the sun. The golden quiver on his back supplied an infinite volley, and Apollo unleashed a storm of divine light. 100 arrows sang through the air, each a detonation, each striking the beast. The python writhed, its massive body pinned by spears of pure sunlight. Its ancient hide was shredded, its dark ichor steaming away as it hit the ground. The creature was being unmade, dissolved by the very concept of rational light. The monster, in its death throes, reared back one last time, blotting out the sky, its head rising above the peaks of Parnassus, preparing for a final strike that would shatter the valley. It was all rage and shadow. Apollo, calm, drew the bowstring back to his ear. He knocked one final arrow. Into this shaft, he poured not just sunlight, but his entire identity, his authority, his role as the god of truth, his claim to this valley, and the memory of his mother's suffering. This was the arrow of destiny. He released. The arrow flew past the snapping fangs, straight down the monster's throat, deep into its core, striking the fissure from which it was born. There was no sound, only a terrible pressurized silence, followed by an explosion of pure, cleansing fire that erupted from within the serpent. The python froze. It shuddered, a tectonic spasm that shook the continent. Then, the ancient body began to fail. It did not collapse, it dissolved. The scales, the flesh, the ancient bones, the primal malice, it all unwound, turning into black steam and dark mud, which flowed rapidly back into the chasm, consumed by the golden fire. The guardian of chaos was annihilated, its energy pulled back into the earth, purified by the new god. Silence descended. Apollo stood, breathing heavily, his golden bow smoking in his hand. The oppressive, sulfurous fog was gone, burned away by the final detonation. For the first time in centuries, the clean, warm light of the sun, his sun, filled the valley of Delphi. The poisoned Castalian spring, which bubbled nearby, began to run clear. He had won. He had avenged his mother. He had conquered the epicenter of primal chaos. He walked to the edge of the chasm. The fumes that rose from it were still there, the divine breath of the earth, the key to prophecy, but the poison was gone. The voice of Gaia was no longer screaming, it was whispering. He had claimed the oracle. This place would no longer be Pytho, the place of the serpent. He would rename it Delphi, his sacred center. But as the radiance of victory subsided, Apollo looked at his hands. They were covered in the black, spiritual stain of the python's ancient ichor. He had killed an ancient being, a child of the Earth Mother herself. He was the god of purity, but he had just committed a necessary, cosmic murder. He was stained, victorious, powerful, and divine, but unclean. Before he could build his temple, before he could speak the truth of Zeus, the god of medicine and purity first had to be purified himself. Apollo stood victorious in the cleansed valley of Delphi. The air was breathable for the first time in ages, the light of the sun was pure, and the terrible guardian of the chasm was destroyed, its dark energy dissolved back into the earth. He had won the center of the world. Yet, the victory felt incomplete. As the adrenaline of divine combat faded, a new sensation settled upon him, a cold, spiritual weight. He looked at his hands, the hands that held the golden bow. They were stained. It was not a physical stain, it was miasma, the inescapable, spiritual pollution of blood guilt. He had killed the python, but the python was not just a monster. It was a child of Gaia, the Earth Mother, an entity of the primal world order he had just overthrown. He, the new god of purity, medicine, and civilized law, was now cosmically unclean. The earth itself, though cleansed of the python's poison, seemed to silently recoil from his feet. He could not build his temple here. He could not speak prophecies of divine truth while stained with the blood of the previous regime. The oldest laws of the cosmos, the laws that even Zeus had to respect, demanded atonement. Before the god of order could rule, he had to submit to that very order. The judgment came from on high, confirmed by Zeus but dictated by the ancient Titaness Themis, the embodiment of divine law. For the crime of killing Gaia's sacred guardian, Apollo was sentenced to exile. For 8 full years, a cycle known to the gods as a great year, he must walk the mortal world, not as a radiant conqueror, but as a servant. He had to be purified through labor and humility. Apollo, the sun god, left his newly won prize. He turned his back on the whispering chasm of Delphi and traveled north, his divine light veiled, his golden bow silenced. His destination was the Vale of Tempe, a lush, narrow valley in Thessaly, carved by the pristine Punius River. This valley was the antithesis of the corrupted Delphi. It was pure, untouched nature. There, he bathed in the sacred waters, the first ritual of cleansing, washing away the grime of the battle, but the miasma on his soul remained. From Tempe, he walked, no longer a god blazing across the sky, but a traveler on the dusty roads. He arrived at the gates of King Admetus of Phaerae. Admetus was a man known throughout Greece for one rare quality. He was deeply and genuinely pious, a king who respected the gods and treated his people with kindness. Apollo, appearing as a gifted but nameless traveler, offered his services to the king. Admetus, seeing a strange light in the stranger's eyes, hired him. And so, Apollo, slayer of the Python, master of the sun, and the most beautiful of the gods, became a shepherd. His task, for 8 years, was to watch the flocks of a mortal king. This was the ultimate lesson in humility. The god who demanded temples was now sleeping in fields. The god who held the bow of infallible light now carried a simple shepherd's crook. But Apollo did not just endure his servitude, he transformed it. He had brought his lyre. As he watched the sheep graze, he played. He played the music he had declared was his domain, the harmony of the spheres. The effect was supernatural. The crops in the fields of Admetus grew stronger, taller, and richer than any in Greece. The cattle and sheep he guarded became supernaturally healthy. Every birth yielded perfect twins, and the flock swelled beyond counting. But the strangest miracle was the effect his music had on the wild. The predators that usually stalked the flocks were tamed by the sound. Out of the forests of Othrys came the mountain lions, the wolves, and the boars. They did not attack. They came and lay down peacefully beside the lambs, all held in a perfect truce by the god's melody. Apollo, the hunter god, was learning that the harmony of his lyre was a more profound power than the destruction of his bow. He was learning to be the god of peace as well as the god of vengeance. He served King Admetus faithfully, learning the contours of the mortal world, the rhythm of the seasons, and the quiet strength of humility. The 8 years passed. The sentence was served. The blood debt he owed to the earth for the death of the Python was finally paid. The miasma, the cold stain of the murder, dissolved from his spirit. He stood by the river, clean, pure, and complete. He was no longer just the brilliant, angry youth who had stormed Delphi. He was now the tempered, wise, and purified god, ready to rule. His exile was over. He gifted his favorite cow to King Admetus, picked up his lyre and his golden bow, and turned his face back toward the south. It was time to return to Parnassus, not just as a conqueror, but as the sanctified lord of the oracle. It was time to build his temple. Apollo, his 8-year exile complete, returned to Delphi. He was no longer the stained conqueror. He was the purified lord, returning to claim his sanctified prize. When he set foot in the valley this time, the earth did not recoil. Gaia, her blood price paid through his humble servitude, accepted her new Olympian master. The air was clean, the Castalian spring ran pure, and the valley of Parnassus waited for its purpose. He stood over the deep chasm, the fissure from which the Python had emerged. The monster was gone, but the power remained. A thin, odorless vapor, the pneuma, the divine breath of the earth, still rose from the depths. This was the source of the oracle, the chaotic whisper of the planet's core. When the Python guarded it, the fumes were poison. Now, cleansed by Apollo, they were pure potential. They were truth, waiting for an interpreter. Apollo knew he could not sit here himself, answering the petty squabbles of mortals. He was the god of the sun. His duties spanned the sky. He needed infrastructure. He needed a process, and he needed servants. First, the temple. He did not quarry stone or hire masons. He took his lyre, the same instrument that had pacified lions and wolves in the fields of Admetus, and he began to play. This was the music of creation. As he played, the stones of the valley lifted themselves, cutting and shaping themselves to the harmony, rising into impossible columns and perfect archways. He built his great temple, the walls aligned to the solstice, the inner sanctum, the Hadestown, built directly over the sacred fissure. It was a masterpiece of order, a house of reason built directly on top of the mouth of chaos. The temple was complete, but it was empty. An oracle needs priests to maintain the sacred flame, accept the offerings, and guard the sanctuary. Apollo climbed to the peak of Parnassus and looked down upon the shimmering expanse of the Chrysian Gulf. He scanned the sea, and he found what he was looking for: a merchant ship, cutting cleanly through the waves, its sails full. It was a ship from Crete, from the city of Knossos, crewed by honest, pious sailors carrying cargo to the port of Pylos. These were the men he wanted. Apollo descended the mountain in a flash of light, plunging into the deep blue water. As he hit the sea, his form shifted. He became a creature of impossible speed and brilliance, a massive dolphin, larger than any living creature, his skin shining with the unmistakable golden light of the sun. He sped toward the Cretan ship. The sailors saw the light approaching, a golden torpedo beneath the waves, before the creature burst from the water, leaping clear over their mast, a dazzling, divine arc. The men cried out in awe and terror. This was no animal, this was a god. The dolphin landed and began to race ahead of their bow, leaping, flashing, and radiating a clear, unmistakable command: "Follow me." The captain, recognizing a divine summons that superseded any trade manifest, forgot all about Pylos. He ordered his men to change course, steering the ship in the wake of the blazing dolphin. The creature led them away from their known route and into the unfamiliar waters of the Gulf, finally guiding them to the small, natural harbor of Kira, the port that lay at the foot of the mountain path to Delphi. As the ship's keel scraped the sand, the great dolphin swam onto the beach. The sailors watched, terrified, as the creature convulsed in a column of blinding light. The dolphin form dissolved, and in its place stood the god himself, Apollo, radiant, purified, holding the golden bow and his harmonic lyre. The Cretans fell to their faces on the deck. "Do not fear," Apollo's voice echoed, clearer than any music. "You were merchants from Knossos, seeking profit. But you have been chosen for a higher purpose. Your journey ends here. Your destiny begins. You will follow me up this mountain. You will not trade in trinkets. You will be the guardians of truth. You will be my first priests." Stunned, they followed the god up the winding sacred path, arriving at the gleaming new temple. Apollo led them inside to the Hadestown and showed them the chasm. "Here is the center of the world," he told them. "The earth speaks, and I will be the voice. But that voice must have a vessel." He established his sacred law. A priestess must be chosen, a pure mortal woman. She would sit here, on a sacred golden tripod, positioned directly over the fissure. She will inhale the holy pneuma, and she will fall into a divine trance. In this state, she will not speak her own words, she will speak mine. She will be my conduit, my mouthpiece. She will be the Pythia. To the Cretan sailors, he gave their charge. "You are the keepers of the gate. You will interpret the sacrifices. You will keep the sacred fire, and you will protect the Pythia. You will translate the truth she speaks to the kings and commoners who seek me. You came here as sailors following a dolphin. You will remain here as the honored priests of Delphi." The temple was built. The priesthood was established. The process was defined. The oracle of Apollo, the world's direct line to the will of Zeus, was officially open for business. While Apollo waged his war against the Python, served his exile, and built his monument to civilization at Delphi, his twin sister walked a different path. The story of the divine twins is one of duality, and as Apollo claimed the sun, Artemis claimed the wild. When she vanished from Delos, Artemis did not seek out centers of power or polluted valleys in need of cleansing. She was drawn by an instinctual pull to the purest, most untouched land in the world, the highlands of Arcadia. This was a land of ancient pine forests, snow-capped peaks, and cold, clear rivers. This was a place that did not need a temple, because the entire landscape was already a sanctuary. But Artemis knew that a domain, even one chosen by instinct, must be secured. She had watched her mother, Leto, suffer horribly at the whims of Hera, trapped by a marriage she did not choose. Artemis, the newborn midwife, the witness to the agony, made a decision. She would never be used as a political pawn. She would never be mastered. Armed with her silver bow and an iron will that matched her brother's, she ascended to Olympus to confront their father, Zeus. While Apollo had to earn his place through battle and purification, Artemis arrived and made demands. She found Zeus on his throne and, ignoring the protocol of the court, stated her terms. First, and most importantly, she demanded the right to eternal virginity. To the Olympian court, this was shocking. Marriage was the currency of power, the tool Zeus and Hera used to forge alliances. But Artemis saw it as submission. Her request was a declaration of absolute independence. She would belong to no man, no god, and no king. She would be her own mistress, forever. Zeus, who had seen his son's posture and plot for thrones, was utterly charmed by this fierce, silver-eyed daughter who asked only for power over herself. He laughed, the thunder rolling, and granted the request. "What else?" he asked. Artemis continued. She wanted a hunting tunic, dyed saffron, but cut short above the knee, so she could run freely through the forests, unbound by the long robes of the other goddesses. She wanted the finest hunting hounds in creation. She wanted dominion over all mountains, all forests, and all wild places. And she wanted companions. She asked for 60 nymphs from the ocean, and 20 nymphs from the rivers, all of whom would take the same vow of maidenhood she had. She was not just claiming a territory, she was building her court. Zeus granted every request. He was proud of this strange, wild daughter who mirrored his own authority but rejected his vices. Artemis left Olympus, her domain secured by oath. She now had to collect her assets. She went first to the wild god, Pan, the goat-legged spirit of Arcadia. Pan, the embodiment of primal chaos, recognized her as the embodiment of primal order within the wild. He revered her. She asked for his finest hounds. He gave her 7 of the swiftest, strongest supernatural dogs in existence, 3 bred from shadow, 2 from wind, and 2 that could track the scent of divinity itself. Next, she gathered her attendants. She went to the rivers and the sea and chose her nymphs, the swiftest runners and the truest archers. This was her new sisterhood, the huntresses of Artemis. They swore the oath, dedicating themselves to the wild and to their freedom, under the protection of their mistress. Artemis was now complete. While Apollo established himself in his stone temple at Delphi, the center of the polis, or civilized city-state, Artemis became the goddess of the antithesis. Her kingdom was the wilderness, the fringe, the boundary between the cultivated and the untamed. And as Apollo claimed the sun, she claimed the moon. Her light was not the harsh, revealing, golden blaze of her brother. Her light was the cool, silver illumination of the night. His was the light of reason, prophecy, and public law. Hers was the light of mystery, intuition, and the cycles of nature. Apollo's music brought peace to predators. Artemis's silence was the predator. This was the fundamental divide that would define their relationship forever. Apollo sought to bring humanity toward the gods through harmony and prophecy. Artemis sought to protect the wild from humanity, establishing the sacred boundaries that mortals must never cross. Her first act as the established goddess was not to build, but to hunt. Under the light of the first full moon of her reign, she and her new band of huntresses, flanked by their howling, supernatural hounds, swept through the forests of Arcadia. They were not hunting for sport or for food. They were establishing their territory. They were a silver storm, swift, silent, and deadly, a warning to any who would defile her sacred groves. The wild now had a guardian, and she was just as dangerous, and just as pure, as the sun god who ruled Delphi. The twins were established. Apollo, the god of civilization, ruled from his golden temple at Delphi, speaking the will of Zeus, his power centered on the city, the law, and the harmony of the lyre. Artemis, mistress of the wilderness, roamed the mountains of Arcadia, her kingdom the forest, her law the arrow, her music the silence of the hunt. They were the sun and the moon, opposite, balanced, and, for the moment, separate. They ruled their domains in peace until the day the ultimate sin was committed, hubris. And the target of that hubris was the one being they held in higher regard than any law or wildland, their mother, Leto. The scene was Thebes, a prosperous and powerful city ruled by King Amphion. His wife was Queen Niobe, a woman who, by every mortal standard, had won life's lottery. She was wealthy, she was royalty, and most importantly, she was fertile. She had 14 perfect children, 7 sons, strong and athletic, and 7 daughters, beautiful and graceful. Niobe looked at her perfect family, and her pride swelled, eclipsing her piety. It began during the city's annual festival honoring Leto. The women of Thebes gathered at the altars, offering incense and prayers to the mother of the divine twins, thanking her for fertility and protection. Niobe, dressed in gold, stormed out of the palace and interrupted the ceremony. "Why?" she demanded, her voice ringing across the courtyard. "Why do you worship her? Why worship Leto? What has she truly done? She has 2 children. 2. I have seen her statues, and I have seen my own reflection. I am queenlier than she. I am more blessed." She pointed back to her palace. "I have 7 sons. I have 7 daughters. I am 7 times the mother Leto ever was. My happiness is secure. Even if misfortune took 1 or 2, I would still have more than she. Stop wasting your incense on her. Worship me. I am the true icon of motherhood." The women of Thebes, terrified of the blasphemy, fled the altar. The insult hung in the air, heavy and sharp as ozone. And it traveled. An insult spoken against a god reaches them instantly. On Delos, Leto heard the boast. After all her suffering, the curse, the python, the 9 days of torment, the exile, To be mocked by a pampered mortal was the final humiliation. She had borne gods. Niobe had borne children who would die. Leto, weeping with rage and shame, left her sanctuary and went to her children. She found them together, a rare meeting in the clouds above the world. She told them what Niobe had said, how the queen of Thebes had counted her children like currency and found a goddess lacking. Artemis, the cold virgin, and Apollo, the god of pure order, listened. Their domains were different, but their blood was the same. They shared the memory of the darkness, the hunt, the desperation. Their entire divine existence was predicated on the suffering their mother endured to birth them. This was not just an insult to Leto, it was an attack on their very foundation. They looked at each other. They did not need a discussion. They did not need a plan. They were a matched set. Their response would be parallel, perfect, and absolute. They descended upon Thebes, veiled in a golden and silver mist, invisible to mortal eyes. Apollo acted first. Outside the city walls, the 7 sons of Niobe were practicing their sports. They were riding horses, throwing the discus, and practicing their archery. They were the image of proud, mortal youth. From a high hill, invisible, Apollo drew his golden bow. He was the god of archery. They were his target. He released the first arrow, a silent shaft of pestilence. The oldest son, atop his horse, suddenly gasped, clutched his chest, and fell dead before he hit the ground. The other brothers rushed to his side, confused, looking for an attacker. A second sunbeam arrow flew, striking the next son. Then the third. They tried to flee. They could not flee the sun. Apollo tracked them, his arrows infallible, his face grim and focused. In the space of 10 minutes, all 7 sons lay dead in the dust, struck down by the god they had ignored. News reached the palace. Niobe screamed, a sound of animal grief. Her confidence shattered. She gathered her 7 daughters in the main hall, clutching them, weeping. Perhaps, even in her grief, she still thought herself superior, her 7 beautiful daughters still outnumbering Leto's single girl. She prayed to the gods, too late, trying to shield her children. Then, Artemis acted. A cold wind blew through the palace. The doors swung open. The silver goddess entered the hall, invisible as a moonbeam, her face as cold as the light she commanded. She was the protector of maidens, but she was also their executioner when piety failed. She drew her silver bow. Her arrows were silent, bringing the cold, painless death of the night. The first daughter fell. The second, trying to comfort her mother, collapsed. Niobe ran, shoving her remaining children into a corner, trying to shield the youngest with her own body. "Spare me this one," she begged the empty air. Artemis fired her last arrow. The shaft passed cleanly through Niobe's arm, missing the queen but striking the final child. One by one, the 7 daughters fell, until Niobe knelt alone in a circle of her dead children. 14 children, gone in an afternoon. Her husband, King Amphion, seeing his entire line erased, drew his sword and ended his own life. Niobe was left, completely alone, her mind shattered. She could not speak. She could not move. She could only sit on the floor of her palace and weep. She wept for days, her body seizing with sobs, unable to die, unable to live. The gods on Olympus, watching the totality of the retribution, finally took pity. This husk was no longer immortal. Zeus reached down and ended her torment. He turned Niobe to stone. They transported her to Mount Sipylus, in her homeland, where she became a rocky outcropping shaped like a weeping woman. And even today, from that stone, water trickles, the eternal tears of the mother who dared to challenge the gods, and who learned the absolute, terrifying unity of the divine twins. The divine twins had established their power in the mortal world, one through unity, and both through terror. The weeping stone of Niobe stood as a permanent monument to their shared, absolute defense of their mother, Leto. But while their blood bound them in vengeance, their domains defined their fundamental opposition. Apollo, having paid his debt for the Python, had opened the doors of civilization at Delphi, inviting mortals to his temple to receive the structured, codified will of the gods. He was the god of the social contract. Artemis was the opposite. Her domain was the wild, the boundary, the sacred space that civilization was forbidden to touch. Her temple was the forest, her law was her own will, and her justice was swift, silent, and absolute. While Apollo built a bridge to mortals, Artemis guarded the wall that separated them. And one mortal, a prince of Thebes, was about to find out how high that wall was. His name was Actaeon. He was a nobleman, a student of the centaur Chiron, and by all accounts, a master hunter. He was pious, skilled, and deeply respectful of the wild lands he roamed. He loved his hounds, and they, in turn, adored him. He was, in many ways, a perfect mortal reflection of the huntress goddess he worshipped. But the gods do not tolerate reflections, they demand worship. One day, on Mount Cithaeron, Actaeon and his party had finished a long and successful hunt. The sun was high, the day was hot. Actaeon, proud of the morning's work, told his companions to rest while he searched for a cool spring to drink from. He wandered off the known path, deeper into the woods than he had ever gone before, guided by the sound of falling water. He pushed aside a curtain of heavy ivy and stepped into a clearing that silenced his breath. It was a perfect grove, untouched, ancient. A clear, cold spring cascaded down a mossy rock face into a crystal pool. This was the sacred grove of Gargaphia. It was her private sanctuary, the one place in all the cosmos Artemis allowed herself to be vulnerable. And she was there. Artemis and her band of nymphs, weary from their own hunt, had laid their silver bows upon the grass and unpinned their short tunics. They were bathing in the pool, laughing, unguarded. Actaeon froze. He was paralyzed. He had not intended this. He had stumbled, by catastrophic accident, upon the forbidden truth. He had seen the mistress of the moon, the eternal virgin goddess, naked. One of the nymphs screamed. The laughter stopped. The clearing fell into a terrifying silence. The nymphs rushed to surround Artemis, trying to shield her body from the mortal gaze, but it was too late. The violation was complete. Artemis turned. Her face, usually serene or focused in the hunt, was now a mask of absolute, cold fury. This was the ultimate transgression. Her sacred vow of independence, the very core of her identity, had been defiled by the gaze of a mortal man. Her silver bow was on the bank, just out of reach. But in her own sanctuary, she did not need it. Actaeon tried to speak, to apologize, to explain. He opened his mouth, but before any sound could escape, Artemis scooped a handful of the sacred water and hurled it in his face. "You saw," she hissed, her voice the sound of cracking ice. "Now go. Boast to your companions that you saw Artemis undefended. Boast, if you can." The water struck him, and the transformation began. It was immediate and horrific. Actaeon raised his hands to his head, feeling a sudden weight. His fingers brushed not hair, but hardening bone and rough velvet. Massive, branching antlers tore themselves from his skull. He cried out, but the sound was not human. It was the terrified guttural bray of a stag. He looked at his arms. They were covered in coarse brown fur, his hands elongating, his fingernails fusing, hardening into cloven hooves. He fell to all fours as his spine cracked and reformed. He was a stag, but locked inside that terrified animal body, his human mind remained. He was Actaeon, and he was trapped. He heard Artemis snap her fingers. He turned, panicked, and fled the grove, crashing through the forest, the stag's body moving with instincts he didn't know he had. He wanted to scream his name. He wanted to beg for mercy. And then he heard the barking. It was his pack. His 50 hounds. His loyal companions, the dogs he had raised from pups, the ones who slept at his feet. They had caught the scent of the new prey, a large, terrified stag crashing through their territory. They did not see their master. They saw the hunt. His own pack ran him down. He saw them coming, Melampus, Pamphagus, Ichnobates, their names catching in his throat, his animal voice unable to form the words. He ran, weeping, his human consciousness screaming in terror as his animal body failed. They swarmed him, leaping, tearing at his flanks. His own loyal hounds, driven by the cold command of the goddess, pulled their master to the ground and tore him to pieces. The justice of the twins was not the same. Apollo demanded piety at his civilized temple. Artemis demanded privacy in her wild domain. He was the god who required mortals to seek truth. She was the goddess who demanded they respect the boundary. To enter his temple was salvation. To enter hers, uninvited, was death. The justice of the divine twins had been established, absolute and terrifying. The fate of Actaeon served as a bloody warning. The domain of Artemis was the boundary of the wild. Her purity was inviolable, and the penalty for trespass was a swift, primal death delivered by the very nature she commanded. Her wrath was the cold, sudden violence of the moon. Apollo, in contrast, ruled the center. He was the god of civilization, his temple at Delphi the nexus of law and culture. But if Artemis punished mortals for trespassing on her privacy, Apollo punished them for trespassing on his authority. His wrath was not the impulsive snap of the wilderness. It was the slow, systematic, and intellectual cruelty of civilized order, which in many ways was far more terrifying. This lesson was learned by a creature of the forest named Marsyas. Marsyas was a satyr, a being of the wild, half man, half goat, a follower of the god Dionysus. He lived in Phrygia, spending his days in the pursuit of rustic pleasure. One day, by a riverbed, he found a unique instrument, an aulos, a double reed flute. It had been invented by the goddess Athena, but she had thrown it away in disgust, noticing in a reflection that playing it, puffing her cheeks and contorting her face, destroyed her divine, intellectual composure. Marsyas, a creature of pure emotion, had no such vanity. He picked up the discarded flute and began to play. He was a natural. The music that poured from the aulos was not the structured, mathematical harmony of Apollo's lyre. It was the music of the earth. It was chaotic, passionate, breathless, and raw. It was the sound of the wind through the pines, the ecstatic rush of the grapevine, the sorrow of the earth itself. The nymphs of the forest, the mortals of Phrygia, all gathered to listen, captivated. Soon, they, and Marsyas himself, began to believe the impossible, that his wild music was more beautiful, more moving, than the perfect, cold harmony of Lord Apollo himself. Puffed up with this hubris, Marsyas made his fatal error. He issued a formal challenge to Apollo, the god of music, a contest, his aulos against the god's lyre. Apollo, hearing the news from his golden throne at Delphi, was deeply insulted. This was not just a challenge, it was an insurrection. It was chaos challenging order. It was a goatman, a creature of primal impulse, daring to suggest his breathy, emotional noise was superior to the divine, intellectual music of the cosmos. And he was using an instrument discarded by the goddess of wisdom. Apollo accepted. The contest was set. The judges would be the 9 muses, the spirits of art and inspiration. The terms were simple and horrific. The winner could inflict any penalty he wished upon the loser. Marsyas, arrogant and ecstatic, played first. He poured his entire soul into the reeds. He played the rage of the thunderstorm, the longing of the deep woods, the joy of the harvest. The music was so powerful, so filled with raw life, that the muses wept. The nymphs and mortals listening were certain the satyr had won. How could the god, with his stiff, mathematical lyre, compete with such feeling? Then, Apollo stood up. He smiled a cold, bright smile. He did not look at Marsyas. He looked at the muses. He placed his hands on his golden lyre. He did not play the music of the earth. He played the music of the stars. His melody was the sound of the planets turning in their orbits, the perfect geometry of the snowflake, the architecture of civilization rising from stone. It was not music of passion, it was music of divine, absolute, unshakable reason. It was technically perfect, infinitely complex, and overwhelming. The muses were split. How could they judge? How could one compare the chaotic heat of the heart with the perfect cold light of the mind? It was a tie. Apollo held up a hand. A tie. But this is a contest of mastery, is it not? A true master has complete control over his art. He proposed a new stipulation, a tiebreaker. We shall both play our instruments upside down, and we must sing while we play. The muses, intrigued, agreed to the new terms. Apollo, the god of intellect, had set his trap. He calmly flipped his lyre over. The instrument was symmetrical. He began to play it perfectly, and as he played, he sang a beautiful, clear hymn to his father, Zeus. The performance was flawless. Then, he turned to Marsyas. The satyr had turned pale. He stared at his aulos. It was a wind instrument. It is physically impossible to play a flute upside down, as the reeds and holes are fixed. And it is absolutely impossible to sing while you are simultaneously blowing into a mouthpiece. Marsyas put the flute to his lips, tried to play, and only a pathetic wet squeak emerged. He had failed. Order had defeated chaos. Intellect had trapped impulse. Apollo had won. Apollo looked at the terrified satyr. Marsyas had dared to challenge the divine, to suggest his crude hide held more music than the god. The penalty was set. For the hubris of daring to outskill the god of harmony, Apollo would enforce the most systematic punishment. He dragged Marsyas to a tall pine tree and, as the nymphs wept, Apollo, the god of clarity and order, took a knife and flayed the satyr alive. He slowly, carefully, peeled the skin from the creature's body. The wrath of the twins was parallel, yet opposite. Artemis, goddess of the wild, punished an accidental trespass by turning a man into an animal, letting the wild consume him. Apollo, god of civilization, punished a deliberate challenge by systematically deconstructing his rival, skinning him like an animal. Both were merciless defenders of their domain. The twins were gods of absolute domains. Artemis ruled the wild, her justice swift, primal, and triggered by violations of purity and privacy, as Actaeon learned when he was torn apart by his own hounds. Apollo ruled civilization, his justice intellectual, legalistic, and triggered by hubris, as Marsyas learned when his skin was separated from his body. But Apollo was not just the god of the lyre and the bow. He was the god of prophecy, the sun, and most complexly, medicine. He was the god who cured, and the god who sent the plague. This duality would define his greatest love and his most profound tragedy. While Apollo ruled at Delphi, his gaze fell upon Caronis, a princess of Thessaly. She was beautiful, and he fell deeply in love, a rare event even for the god. Soon, Caronis was pregnant with Apollo's child, a son destined to change the mortal world. But Apollo was a god of overwhelming light, and his duties at the oracle were demanding. In his absence, he left a guardian to watch over his mortal lover, his sacred bird, the raven. In these ancient days, the raven was not the black bird of ill omen we know. It was a creature of pure, snowy white feathers, possessing a beautiful song. Apollo trusted the raven, but he underestimated the human heart. Caronis, perhaps terrified of her divine lover's volatility, or perhaps simply desiring a mortal life, betrayed the sun god. While pregnant with his child, she agreed to marry a mortal prince, Ischys. The white raven saw the betrayal. Believing it was doing its sacred duty, the bird launched into the sky, flying faster than the wind to Delphi to report the terrible news to its master. It found Apollo at his temple and told him everything. Apollo did not react with rational judgment. He reacted with the wounded pride of a star. His grief instantly supernovaed into rage. But the rage was chaotic, and it struck the nearest target. He turned on the messenger. He cursed the raven for bringing such horrific news, for not pecking out the eyes of the mortal prince. In his fury, his divine light turned negative. He scorched the bird, burning its feathers with a black curse. The raven's snowy plumage turned the deep, oily black of a starless night, and its beautiful song dissolved into the harsh, grating caw of despair. This, Apollo decreed, would forever be the color of the bearer of bad tidings. His rage, however, was far from spent. He turned his gaze toward Caronis. He loved her, and he hated her. He could not bring himself to strike her, the mother of his child. But the betrayal must be punished. He turned to the one being in the cosmos who specialized in the sudden, merciless death of women, his twin. He called for Artemis. Artemis heard her brother's pain. This was a violation of family honor. She did not question the command. She drew her silver bow, and an invisible silver arrow, carrying a sudden fatal sickness, crossed Greece and struck Caronis dead. The news reached Apollo. His lover was dead. His rage vanished, replaced instantly by crushing, absolute regret. Caronis was placed on a funeral pyre, the traditional rite for royalty. As the flames began to lick at the wood, Apollo could not bear the second tragedy, his unborn son, burning with his unfaithful mother. He flashed from Delphi, arriving in the midst of the funeral. He strode into the inferno, his own divine fire parting the flames. He was the god of medicine, and he would be his son's first physician. In the middle of the pyre, he performed a divine caesarean section, reaching into the body of his dead lover and pulling his living infant son from the fire. He named the boy Asclepius. He was the child of the sun god, born from flame, snatched from death. This boy was destined to master his father's domain. Apollo gave the infant to the wisest teacher in the world, the centaur Chiron, the same master who had taught Actaeon. Asclepius grew, and his genius was divine. He learned all of Chiron's secrets, but he inherited his father's brilliance. He became the greatest healer the world had ever known. He didn't just mend bones, he invented surgery. He didn't just identify herbs, he created pharmacology. He was the father of medicine. But like his father, he suffered from pride. And in his case, it was the pride of compassion. His skill became so profound that he did the unforgivable. When a mortal was brought to him, dead before his time, some say it was Hippolytus, torn apart by his own chariot. Asclepius, through a combination of his skill and perhaps the blood of a gorgon, did the impossible. He brought the man back from the dead. The cosmos shuddered. This was the ultimate violation. Hades, lord of the underworld, roared in protest from his throne, demanding to know why his subjects were being stolen. The Moirai, the three fates who spin and cut the thread of every mortal life, were furious. A mortal doctor was reweaving their infallible tapestry. They all brought their complaint to Zeus. And Zeus, the guardian of cosmic balance, agreed. Asclepius had destroyed the single most important boundary in creation, the one separating life from death. Ironically, the son of Apollo had committed the ultimate act of chaos against the divine order his father championed. There could be only one punishment. Zeus took his master thunderbolt, the one forged by the Cyclopes, and hurled it. It struck Asclepius, and the greatest doctor in the world, the son of Apollo, was annihilated, struck dead for the crime of being too good at his job. Apollo, the god of healing, could only watch, helpless, as his own father murdered his son for perfecting his art. The divine order, which Apollo himself championed, had destroyed him. He, the god of medicine and healing, stood helpless as his father, Zeus, struck down his son, Asclepius, for the crime of perfecting that very art. The god of clarity and reason was consumed by a grief so profound that it eclipsed the sun. Reason vanished, leaving only the howl of a grieving father. Apollo's rage demanded a target. He was a god, but he was not omnipotent. He could not raise his bow against Zeus. The king of Olympus was the source of all power, the absolute monarch. To strike Zeus was to strike the cosmos itself, an act of suicide. But the logic of vengeance is rarely so direct. Apollo could not attack the hand that threw the bolt, but he could attack the forge that built it. His target became clear. The thunderbolt that killed Asclepius had been hammered into existence by the elder Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, and Argesh, the ancient, one-eyed smiths who served Hephaestus and supplied the arsenal of the king. Apollo left the mortal world. He did not travel as a beam of light. He moved like a black hole, a vortex of focused despair. He traveled to the divine forge, deep beneath the volcanic mountain of Etna. He did not knock. He did not announce his grievance. He arrived as an executioner. The great Cyclopes were at their anvils, the furnace heart of the world roaring, hammering out a new storm. They looked up, sensing a dark presence, and saw the god of the sun, his face a mask of terrible calm, his golden bow already drawn. These were the same smiths who, under Hephaestus, had crafted that very bow. Now, it was turned against them. Apollo said nothing. He unleashed his arsenal. The god of the lyre vanished, and the god of the plague emerged. He fired his golden arrows, shafts of concentrated sunlight and pestilence, the same infallible shafts that had destroyed the Python and decimated Niobe's sons. The ancient smiths roared, reaching for their hammers, but they were artisans, not warriors. Apollo was the god of archery. One by one, he struck them, executing the weapons manufacturers of Olympus. The forge fell silent. The fire of Etna died. The creators of the thunderbolt were dead. This was an act of profound rebellion. Asclepius, a demigod, had violated the barrier of mortal life. Apollo, a full Olympian, had just attacked the critical infrastructure of the gods. He had effectively disarmed Zeus. He had declared war on the security of the cosmos. From the peak of Olympus, Zeus roared. The universe shook. This was not the act of a grieving son. This was high treason. He summoned Apollo. The god of the sun, his rage spent, his arrows gone, stood before the throne of his father. Zeus, acting not as a parent but as the cosmic monarch, pronounced the judgment. There was only one sentence for such a crime: Tartarus, the eternal pit of darkness, the prison of the Titans. Zeus raised his arm, holding his final, remaining thunderbolt, ready to cast his own son into the void forever. But as the bolt began to crackle, a shadow fell before the throne. It was Leto. She was the mother who had endured Hera's curse, the exile who had wandered the earth, the Titaness who had given birth clinging to a palm tree. She had suffered more than any to bring these twins into the world. Now, seeing one of them about all to be extinguished, she threw herself at Zeus's feet. She did not plead for justice, she pleaded for mercy. She reminded Zeus that Apollo had been his most loyal son, the voice of his will at Delphi. She reminded him that this was not an act of malice, but of madness, born from the grief Zeus himself had inflicted by killing Apollo's son. Zeus looked at Leto, the goddess he had once loved, the mother of his two most brilliant children. Her plea stayed his hand. He lowered the bolt. Not Tartarus. But the crime was too severe to ignore. The punishment must be absolute. Apollo was to be stripped of his divinity, his radiant power locked away. He was exiled from Olympus. And once again, he was sentenced to servitude, forced to labor on the mortal plane as a common slave. For 1 full year, he would serve a mortal, not as a purified god choosing humility, but as a convicted felon paying his debt. And the mortal chosen was the only man on earth pious enough to be entrusted with such a charge, King Admetus of Phaerae. For the second time in his divine life, Apollo was cast out. He had lost his son, murdered the ancient smiths, and was now a powerless exile, returning to the only mortal home he had ever known, this time not in dignity, but in disgrace. This was the profound duality of the divine twins, the cosmic balance of sun and moon. While one ascended, the other fell. Apollo was at his absolute lowest point. As punishment for murdering the Cyclopes, Zeus had stripped him of his radiance, his power, and his honor. The god of the sun, the master of Delphi, the killer of the Python, was once again in exile, and this time it was not a purifying ritual, it was a hard prison sentence. He returned to the court of King Admetus, not as the divine shepherd whose music charmed the beasts, but as a convicted felon, a disgraced god sentenced to hard labor. shoveling the stables and tending the herds as the lowliest of slaves, his divine light trapped beneath a veneer of mortal exhaustion and profound grief. The sun god was eclipsed. But as the sun fell, the moon rose to its zenith. While Apollo was enslaved by mortal law, Artemis was proving her absolute command over the threats to the divine. Her challenge was not a grieving father or a cosmic law. Her challenge was brute force and cosmic arrogance. They were the Elodi, Otis and Ephialtes. They were twin giants, sons of Poseidon, and they grew at a supernatural rate, 9 inches every month. By the time they were 9 years old, they were colossal beings of arrogance and power, stronger than any titan or god, save perhaps Zeus himself. They grew bored of the mortal world and looked toward Olympus. They proved their power in an act of impossible humiliation. They hunted down Ares, the Olympian god of war, ambushed him, defeated him, and stuffed him into a large bronze jar, sealing it tight. For 13 months, the god of war was their prisoner, screaming in the darkness, nearly fading from existence while the other gods were powerless to find or free him. The giants, having proven the gods weak, announced their final plan. They would build a staircase to heaven by piling Mount Ossa on top of Mount Olympus, and Mount Pelion on top of Ossa. They would storm the divine hall. But their hubris did not end with conquest. They had demands. Ephialtes declared that he would take Hera, queen of the gods, as his prize. And Otis, his twin, declared that he would hunt, capture, and forcibly marry the one goddess in the cosmos defined by her untouchable freedom, Artemis. This was not the accidental glimpse of a mortal hunter like Actaeon. This was a declaration of war against her very existence, a direct threat to the vow that was the core of her identity. While the Olympians panicked, their god of war still trapped in a jar, Artemis grew cold. She knew of an ancient prophecy, perhaps one her own brother had spoken at Delphi before his fall. The giants were fated to be invincible against any foe, god or mortal, with one exception. They could only be killed by each other. Artemis knew she could not match their brute strength. They had already defeated Ares. She would have to use their own arrogance against them. She sent an illusion, a brief vision to Otis, appearing as a huntress impressed by his strength, hinting that she was tired of her vow and might be interested in a being powerful enough to claim her. She told him to meet her on the secluded island of Naxos. Both giants arrived. Otis, arrogant, assumed she was there to surrender to him. Ephialtes, furious that his brother was chosen, came to claim her for himself. They immediately began to argue, their massive voices shaking the island, their rivalry and egos inflamed. "She came for me," one bellowed. "She desires true strength, which only I possess," shouted the other. As they stood on opposite sides of a wide forest clearing, roaring their threats, their conflict was interrupted. A creature of impossible beauty stepped into the clearing, a magnificent, snow-white stag, its antlers like polished silver. It paused directly in the center of the space, precisely equidistant between the two giants. Both giants, being hunters, reacted instantly. Both thought this was a test from the goddess, or perhaps a trophy to win her favor. Both, seeking to prove their mastery, hurled their massive bronze-tipped hunting spears at the stag from opposite ends of the clearing. But the stag was Artemis. With the speed of a moonbeam, the goddess vanished the microsecond the spears left their hands. The two spears, having missed their divine target, continued their lethal trajectory across the clearing. Otis's spear, thrown with the force of an earthquake, slammed deep into the chest of Ephialtes. Ephialtes' spear, thrown with equal rage, impaled Otis. They stood for a moment, shocked, staring at each other, the prophecy fulfilled. They collapsed simultaneously, killed by the only hands in the cosmos strong enough to fell them, their own. Artemis reappeared, her silver bow in her hand, watching the giants bleed out. While the god of war suffocated in a jar and the god of the sun shoveled manure as a slave, the goddess of the hunt had single-handedly saved Olympus, outwitting the greatest threat the gods had ever faced, preserving her independence through perfect, cold, and flawless strategy. The fates of the divine twins could not have been more divergent. Apollo, the god of order, had fallen into disgrace. Stripped of his radiance by Zeus as punishment for murdering the Cyclopes, he was a slave in the mortal court of Admetus, his grief for his son Asclepius a cold weight, his divinity a muted ache. The sun was in a total eclipse. In perfect opposition, the moon was ascendant. Artemis, having saved Olympus from the Elodi giants, was at the zenith of her power. She was the inviolate queen of the wilderness, her authority absolute, her independence secured not just by her vow, but by the proven strength and intellect that had outwitted the beings who had captured the god of war. And it was then, while she ruled the forests of Arcadia and Crete, that she met Orion. Orion was not a giant of the same breed as Otis and Ephialtes. He was not a chaotic force bent on destruction. He was the son of Poseidon, a giant hunter, and by all accounts, the greatest mortal tracker the world had ever known, gifted by his father with the ability to walk on the surface of the waves. He was powerful, skilled, and unlike Actaeon or the Elodie, he approached the goddess of the hunt not with trespass or with the intent to possess, but with pure professional respect. He did not challenge her. He did not desire her. He simply wanted to hunt with her. He was the only male in existence whose skill matched her own. Artemis, the eternal loner, the goddess defined by her rejection of all male companionship, saw in him not a threat, but a peer. For the first time, she lowered her guard. She accepted. Together, they became the masters of the wild. The silver goddess and the giant hunter, their twin packs of hounds running as one, were the most lethal force in creation. Her nymphs watched, stunned, as their cold mistress, who had murdered Actaeon for a glance, laughed and competed with Orion. This was not romance, it was the profound bond of two perfect predators. But Orion, comfortable in this new partnership, began to suffer from the hubris of his own skill. He boasted that he was so great, he would not stop until he had hunted every last beast from the face of the earth. This was a direct violation of Gaia, the Earth Mother, and a threat to the sacred balance that Artemis, as protector of the wild, was meant to uphold. This news, this disturbance in the cosmos, reached Apollo. His sentence of servitude had ended, and he had returned to Delphi, his power restored but his spirit darkened by the grief of Asclepius and the humility of his slavery. He heard of Orion's boast, but more importantly, he saw his sister, the pure, cold moon, softening. He saw this companionship as a stain, a form of chaos entering her perfect, ordered world. He feared she would break her sacred vow, collapsing the very identity that made her his twin, his balance. Apollo, the god of order, whose son was killed for violating that order, decided that Orion, this arrogant giant who threatened the natural world and his sister's purity, must be removed. And he knew, with the cold logic that defined him, that the only person who could kill Orion was Artemis. And the only way to make her do it was to use her own perfection against her. He devised the most personal, cruel, and perfect betrayal. He waited. Orion, hunting the creatures of the sea, used his gift from Poseidon to walk far out into the ocean, chasing his prey. From the distant shoreline, with the glare of the midday sun, Apollo's sun, reflecting off the waves, Orion was nothing. He was a tiny, dark speck, bobbing in a sea of blinding light, his identity totally obscured. Apollo went to his sister, whom he found on the beach, practicing with her silver bow. "Sister," he said, his voice smooth, brotherly. "It is good to see you, but I fear your new companion has softened your eye. You are a master of the forest, true, but your arrows are for the shadows. My arrows are of the sun. They fly farther and strike truer." Artemis lowered her bow, her eyes narrowing. "My aim is as true as yours, brother. You know this." Apollo smiled his cold, golden smile. "This was the trap. Perhaps. But your skill is for the near target. The beast in the trees. You lack the artillery. Look." He pointed out to the sea, into the blinding glare of his own light. "Do you see that? That dark speck, bobbing on the farthest wave. Even I can barely see it. The glare is too bright. The distance impossible. I wager even you, mistress of the hunt, cannot make that shot." It was a direct challenge to her divine authority, from her only rival, her twin. Her pride, the very armor of her identity, consumed her. She did not ask what the target was. It did not matter. Her brother had challenged her infallibility. "There is no target I cannot hit," she said. Artemis drew her silver bow. She squinted against her brother's sun, her divine eye calculating the impossible distance, the wind, the glare. She released. The silver arrow sang, an invisible streak, and flew true, striking the distant speck. The speck vanished beneath the waves. Artemis turned to her brother, a smug look of victory on her face. Apollo did not smile. His task, the restoration of order, was complete. Later that day, the tide washed the body ashore. It was Orion, pierced directly through the head by a single silver arrow. Artemis saw him. She saw the body of her only friend, her only hunting companion, her peer. And she understood, instantly, the setup, the taunt, the impossible target, the blinding light. She looked at Apollo, who stood watching her, his face impassive. She saw his betrayal. In the name of preserving her vow, he had tricked her into destroying the only living being she had ever truly respected. Her grief was absolute. This was the only time the virgin huntress wept. She could not bring him back. Zeus had forbidden that power when he struck down Asclepius. So she did the only thing she could. She gently lifted the body of her friend and his loyal hound, Sirius, and placed them in the night sky. He would become the constellation Orion, the great hunter, forever chasing the Pleiades across the heavens, so that she, the moon, could travel with him every single night, forever. But the bond between the divine twins, the sun and the moon, was shattered by the act. The bond between the divine twins was shattered. Apollo's calculating betrayal, tricking his sister into murdering Orion, the only companion she ever respected, had carved a rift between the sun and the moon. They still shared the sky, but they no longer shared a kinship. They moved in their orbits in cold, celestial silence, one chasing the other, the betrayer and the betrayed, their unity broken forever. Apollo returned to his duties at Delphi, his order restored, but he was isolated. His cold, rational act had cost him the respect of his other half. Artemis returned to Arcadia, but her grief for Orion had not softened her, it had turned her to iron. Her trust in the world, in mortals, and especially in her own family, was gone. The wild, once her sanctuary of freedom, now became her fortress. Her sisterhood of huntresses, once a band of joyful maidens, now became a militant order. And her sacred vow of virginity, the vow her brother had supposedly killed to protect, was no longer a declaration of independence. It was a cold, inflexible, absolute law. Any breach would be met not just with justice, but with ice. In this hardened, silver court, Artemis had one favorite. Her name was Callisto. She was the daughter of a king, but had forsaken mortal life to join the hunt. She was the swiftest runner, the keenest tracker, and the most devoted of all the nymphs. Callisto adored Artemis, and Artemis saw in Callisto the perfection of the vow, a surrogate for the companionship she had lost. But purity, in the divine world, is not a shield, it is a lure. And Callisto's devotion attracted the gaze of the one being who respected no boundaries, Zeus, the father of Artemis herself. Zeus, king of Olympus, desired the nymph. He knew, however, that Callisto would rather die than betray her mistress, and he knew Artemis would kill any man who dared approach her inner circle. The vow was absolute. So Zeus, in an act of profound cosmic cruelty, used that very devotion as his weapon. He decided to trick her. He waited until Callisto was alone in a forest clearing, and then he appeared. He did not come as a shower of gold or a raging bull. He came disguised as the one being in the universe Callisto trusted completely. Zeus took the form of Artemis. Callisto, seeing her beloved mistress, ran to embrace her, overjoyed at the personal attention. Zeus, wearing the silver eyes and the huntress's tunic of his own daughter, returned the embrace. And in that moment, he revealed his true form and violated the nymph, shattering her oath, her faith, and her very identity. Callisto was broken. She was traumatized, ashamed, and terrified. She had been betrayed by the very image of her goddess, and in the act, she herself had become the betrayer. She was impure. She had broken the unbreakable law. She fled, hiding her trauma, hiding the physical evidence of the assault which began to grow within her. She continued the hunt, but she was slow, terrified, and distant, shadows gathering in her eyes. Artemis, still rigid with the grief of Orion's betrayal, missed the cause of the trauma, but she recognized the symptoms of a secret. Her favorite was lying. The goddess grew suspicious, her hardened heart feeling not empathy, but the sting of yet another deception. One hot afternoon, Artemis led her huntresses to a hidden, sacred spring, a crystal pool where they ritualistically bathed. Callisto refused. She clutched her tunic, weeping, trying to hide among the trees. Artemis, her patience worn thin by a world of broken trust, saw this not as fear, but as insubordination. This was the fortress protecting a lie. "You will bathe," Artemis commanded, her voice void of warmth. She ordered the other nymphs to bring her. They dragged Callisto into the light and pulled away her tunic, revealing the truth. Callisto, her chief maiden, her favorite, was pregnant. Artemis stared. The air turned to ice. She did not know Zeus was the cause. All she saw was the ultimate evidence of a broken oath. This was the final betrayal. Her brother had taken her companion. Her father, unknowingly, had now corrupted her favorite nymph. All her trust was repaid with lies. All her mercy had been burned away by Apollo's trick. She did not strike Callisto dead. She did something colder. She pronounced a banishment. She exiled her favorite daughter from the hunt, from the sisterhood, and from the sacred protection of the wilderness. She cast Callisto out, pregnant, defiled, and utterly alone. Callisto wandered, defenseless, eventually giving birth to a son, whom she named Arcus. But the tragedy was incomplete. Hera, queen of the gods, had missed the affair, but she saw the result. Unable to punish her divine husband, Zeus, she tracked the victim. She descended upon the banished Callisto. As the nymph begged for the mercy Artemis had denied her, Hera sneered, grabbing her by the hair. "You will pay for the beauty that charmed my husband," Hera decreed. As Callisto screamed, her hands stretched, the fingernails darkening, thickening into claws. Coarse, dark fur erupted across her skin. Her voice, trying to plead, dissolved into a hoarse growl. Hera, in a final act of spite, transformed Callisto into a great bear. Callisto was now trapped, her human mind, her memories, and her grief locked inside an animal body. She was cursed to wander the very forests of Arcadia where she had once reigned as the chief huntress, now the hunted, fleeing the very ritual she had once embodied, while her son, Arcus, was taken away to be raised by others, destined to become a great hunter himself. The rift between the divine twins defined the new celestial order. The sky was a clockwork of their estrangement, the sun and moon, chasing each other in cold silence, the betrayer and the betrayed. On Earth, the consequences of their feud rippled outward, swallowing the mortals caught in their path. Apollo's betrayal had cost Artemis her trust. Artemis's grief had cost Callisto her protection. Hera's jealousy had cost Callisto her humanity. The tragic nymph, now transformed into a great bear, lived a waking nightmare. She was trapped in the body of the beast she once hunted, retaining the full memory and terror of her human mind. She wandered the forests of Arcadia, the very forests sacred to the goddess who had abandoned her. She fled the hunting parties, recognizing the nymph she had once led, hearing the hound she had once trained, her own son raised far away, unaware of his lineage or his mother's fate. Her son was Arcus. He was raised by others, some say the nymph Maya, and grew into a powerful young man, skilled, strong, and the eventual king of the land, which was named Arcadia in his honor. Like his mother, and perhaps inheriting the blessing of his secret divine grandfather, his greatest passion was the hunt. 15 years passed. Arcus, now at the peak of his youth, tracked a magnificent, massive bear deep into the sacred mountains. He cornered the beast in a clearing. The bear turned, rising onto its hind legs, its claws extended. It was Callisto. She stared at the young hunter, and her bear-like rage dissolved. Through the animal eyes, her human soul recognized him. This was not a threat. This was her son. This was Arcus, the infant she had lost, now grown into a perfect man. Overcome with a love that 15 years of misery could not extinguish, her human mind forgot her animal form. She did what any mother would do upon seeing her lost child. She tried to run to him. She held open her massive, clawed arms to embrace him. Arcus saw only a 700-pound bear, rising aggressively, growling a sound she intended as a greeting, and charging him. His training took over. This was the kill. He drew back his heavy hunting javelin, bracing the spear, aiming directly for the great bear's heart. In that microsecond, the cosmos held its breath. Arcus was poised to commit matricide. Callisto was poised to die at the hands of her own son. From Olympus, Zeus watched the ultimate tragedy unfold, a tragedy he had authored the moment he disguised himself as his own daughter. He could not allow this final, horrific sin to occur. Before Arcus could release the spear, Zeus acted. He hurled not a thunderbolt, but a divine whirlwind. The vortex of power tore into the clearing, enveloping both the terrified hunter and the desperate bear, lifting them from the forest floor. The whirlwind pulled them up, past the clouds, past the peak of Olympus, past the orbit of the moon where Artemis watched, silent. Zeus dragged them into the deep, dark safety of the cosmos. To save them from the tragedy on Earth, and to honor the suffering of the woman he had destroyed, he immortalized them. He placed Callisto among the stars, transforming her into the magnificent constellation, Ursa Major, the Great Bear. Beside her, to keep her company forever, he placed her son, Arcus, as the constellation Ursa Minor, the Little Bear. Mother and child, lost on Earth, were reunited forever in the heavens. But Hera, watching from Olympus, was incandescent with rage. Her husband had not only saved his mistress and their illegitimate child, he had honored them, setting them as eternal beacons in the sacred sky, where all the world could see them. She could not undo Zeus's act, but she could add one final drop of venom. Hera went to the ancient titans of the sea, Oceanus and Tethys, who guarded the horizons of the world. She complained that the mistress of Zeus was now being honored, allowed to bathe her starry image in their pure primal waters. She demanded, as Queen of Heaven, that they forbid the bears from ever touching the ocean. The ancient sea gods, respecting Hera's domain over marriage, agreed. They cursed the constellations. Ursa Major and Ursa Minor were forbidden from ever dipping below the horizon. They were made circumpolar, cursed to forever circle the North Star, never resting, never setting, never allowed to touch the cool relief of the sea. They remain there, an eternal, restless monument to Zeus's crime, Hera's jealousy, and the cold justice of Artemis, whose grief, first born from her brother's betrayal, had set the entire tragedy in motion. The betrayal of Orion created a permanent, fractured silence between the divine twins. The sun and moon patrolled their skies as estranged monarchs, their parallel domains no longer complementing, only contrasting. Apollo, having paid his debt for the murder of the Cyclopes, returned to Delphi, hardened and isolated. Artemis, her trust shattered by her brother, retreated into a colder, harsher defense of her wilderness. Their bond was severed, and the heavens were now filled with the starry memorials of their family's victims: Orion, Callisto, and Arcus. They were no longer a unit. They were now rivals, two opposite poles of divine power. And the world was about to give them a battlefield on which to map their Cold War, the city of Troy. The great conflict began when Paris, a prince of Troy, abducted Helen, the queen of Sparta. In response, 1,000 ships, the largest army the world had ever seen, gathered under the command of the High King, Agamemnon. They assembled at the port of Aulis, ready to sail across the Aegean and bring Troy to its knees. But they could not sail. A dead, suffocating calm settled over the harbor. For weeks, not a single breeze rippled the water. The sails hung limp. The 1,000 ships sat motionless as the army grew restless, supplies dwindled, and the heat bred disease. The invasion was paralyzed. Agamemnon demanded answers from his high prophet, Calchas. The prophet, shaking with terror, revealed the cause. The fleet was being held hostage by divine will. King Agamemnon himself had committed hubris against Artemis. Months earlier, during a successful hunt, Agamemnon killed a magnificent stag and boasted aloud to his court. Not even Artemis herself could have made a better shot. It was the sin of Niobe and the arrogance of Marsyas. Artemis, still cold with the grief of Orion, whom Apollo had tricked her into killing precisely because of his hunting boasts, was in no mood for mercy. She heard the king's boast, and her response was not a swift arrow, it was a strategic suffocation. She put the entire Greek war machine in a chokehold, canceling the wind, demonstrating that she, the goddess of the wild, held absolute power over their civilized ambitions. Calchas delivered the verdict. There was only one price Artemis would accept to release the winds. Agamemnon, the man who boasted of his skill, must sacrifice the person dearest to him, his own firstborn daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon was destroyed, trapped between his sacred oath to the army and his love for his child. He chose ambition. He sent a message to his wife, tricking her into sending Iphigenia to the camp under the pretense that she was to be married to the great warrior, Achilles. The girl arrived, was dressed in wedding robes, and was led to an altar. But Artemis is a goddess of contradictions. She is the merciless executioner, yet she is also the sacred protector of maidens. She had demanded the sacrifice to break the king's spirit, to exact the ultimate price for his hubris. But as the knife was raised and Iphigenia stood trembling, Artemis found she could not watch the innocent die for the father's crime. At the last possible second, the goddess sent a thick mist, snatched Iphigenia from the altar, and replaced her with a deer. The deer was sacrificed, the debt was paid, and the winds howled back to life. The Greek fleet sailed for Troy. Artemis, her justice still cold, transported the terrified Iphigenia to the distant land of Taurus, to serve as the high priestess of her temple, saved, but a prisoner nonetheless. The war began. For 9 long years, the Greeks and Trojans fought to a bloody stalemate beneath the walls of the city. The gods watched, choosing sides. Hera and Athena chose the Greeks. And Apollo, the sun god, chose the Trojans, particularly their noble prince, Hector. In the 10th year, the Greek camp was struck by another paralyzing disaster. This time, it did not come from the sea, but from the sky. A pestilence erupted. First the mules and camp dogs began to die, then the soldiers, dropping in ranks, their bodies rotting in the heat. The funeral pyres burned day and night. This was not the windless suffocation of Artemis. This was the direct, targeted wrath of her brother. The cause, once again, was King Agamemnon. In a recent raid, the Greeks had captured 2 maidens. One, Briseis, was given to Achilles. The other, Chryseis, was given to Agamemnon as his prize. But Chryseis was the daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo. The old priest had walked into the Greek camp under a flag of truce, offering a massive ransom for his daughter. Agamemnon, his arrogance intact even after the incident at Aulis, brutally insulted the priest. He cursed him, threatened him, and threw him out of the camp, refusing the ransom and defiling the servant of the sun god. The old man walked away and prayed to his god. Apollo heard. His rage was absolute. This king, this mortal, had insulted his mother's honor by comparing himself to Artemis, and now had directly insulted Apollo's honor by abusing his priest. Still grieving his own son, Asclepius, Apollo had no patience left for arrogant kings. He descended from Olympus, silent as the night, his face dark with rage. He sat near the Greek ships, drew his golden bow, and let his arrows fly. But these were not the arrows of light. These were the arrows that carried the plague. For 9 days, the god of medicine decimated the Greek army with pestilence. The greatest war in history was now framed by the power of the divine twins, their estrangement mirrored on the battlefield. The war was started by the mercy of Artemis and nearly ended by the plague of Apollo. They were now active combatants on opposite sides of the conflict. The Cold War between the siblings was about to turn hot. The greatest conflict in mortal history, the Trojan War, had become the chessboard for the gods. The personal, bitter estrangement between Apollo and Artemis, born from the betrayal over Orion, was now forced into a new context. Their Cold War was interrupted by a hot one. And in this new war, the hierarchies of the cosmos were made painfully clear. The gods chose factions. Hera and Athena, driven by an ancient grudge from the judgment of Paris, were the unshakable patrons of the Greeks. But Apollo, the sun god, had chosen the Trojans. He loved the city and its noble prince, Hector. This allegiance forced a difficult choice for his estranged twin. Artemis, despite her grudge against her brother, was bound by a force stronger than their feud, their blood. Where Apollo stood, and where their mother, Leto, stood, was where she must stand. The divine twins, despite their personal rift, were now allied, along with Ares and Aphrodite, as the divine patrons of Troy. The war raged into its 10th year. The conflict had escalated beyond the mortal soldiers. Finally, Zeus, tired of the stalemate, dropped the leash. He gave the gods permission to descend from Olympus and intervene directly, to join the battle physically. The plains of Troy erupted in divine chaos. This was the Theomachy, the battle of the gods. Athena, goddess of wisdom, sought out Ares, god of war, and felled him with a massive boulder. Poseidon, lord of the sea, strode onto the battlefield to confront the divine protector of Troy, Apollo. But the most brutal confrontation was not between equals. It was an execution of rank. Hera, queen of the gods, furious at the Trojan resistance and vibrating with her hatred for all things related to her husband's affairs, sought her own opponent. Her gaze landed on the youngest Olympians supporting Troy, the children of Leto. She found Artemis, silver bow in hand, moving through the battle to protect the soldiers of Troy. Hera descended, her face a mask of royal contempt. This was not just a battle, it was the settling of an ancient grudge. This was the queen confronting the daughter of the woman who had defied her curse. "How dare you raise your bow against me?" Hera's voice boomed, silencing the mortal combat around them. "How dare you, child? You may be a lion among mortal women, striking down Niobe's daughters, but it is a fool's errand to challenge your betters. You are the child of Leto, and you will learn your place." Artemis, proud, hardened by betrayal, and the undefeated mistress of the wild, stood her ground. But she was facing the true queen of the cosmos, the embodiment of divine authority. Before the goddess of the hunt could even knock an arrow, Hera lunged. This was not a fight. It was a humiliation. Hera, with one powerful hand, seized Artemis by both wrists, neutralizing her. With her other hand, Hera yanked the sacred quiver and the silver bow, the weapon forged by Hephaestus, the weapon that had killed Orion and the Elodie, off Artemis's back. And then, in an act of supreme, domestic tyranny, the Queen of Heaven began to beat the goddess of the hunt, striking her about the head and ears with her own sacred weapons. The silver bow cracked. The arrows scattered. Artemis, the indomitable huntress, the virgin queen, was completely overpowered, spanked like a disobedient child in the middle of the battlefield. The humiliation broke her. Artemis burst into tears, a profound, agonizing sound not heard since the death of Orion. She tore herself free from Hera's grasp, leaving her broken weapons behind, and fled. She did not just leave the battlefield, she fled the mortal plane, flying weeping back to the sanctuary of Olympus. She collapsed at the feet of her father, Zeus, her tunic torn, her pride shattered. Zeus, watching the divine comedy unfold below, merely laughed gently. He pulled his daughter onto his lap, stroked her hair, and asked, "My child, which of the Olympians has dared to harm you now?" Artemis could only weep that it was his wife. Meanwhile, back on the plains of Troy, her twin, Apollo, had concluded his own confrontation with Poseidon by wisely refusing to fight his uncle over the fate of mere mortals. Their mother, Leto, seeing her daughter humiliated, could only stoop to the battlefield, weeping herself, gathering the scattered, broken pieces of the silver bow and the arrows that Hera had tossed aside in contempt. The incident redefined the twins' relationship. Their personal rift remained, but the war proved they were, in the end, a unit. The children of Leto, junior gods in a celestial court ruled by violent and arrogant elders. Artemis, the savior of Olympus, had been humbled, and her brother, estranged by his own betrayal, had been powerless to defend her. The battle of the gods was a humiliation. Artemis, physically beaten by Hera with her own bow and forced to flee the battlefield of Troy, retreated to the safety of Olympus, her pride shattered. Her humiliation at the hands of the pro-Greek queen only cemented her hatred for their cause, but she was overpowered. She was sidelined, her spirit as broken as her silver bow, leaving her estranged twin, Apollo, to fight for their family's honor alone. Apollo, watching his sister flee and his mother, Leto, forced to humbly gather the broken weapons, internalized a cold, divine rage. His focus, which had been on the entire war, now narrowed to a single point: the preservation of his champion, Hector, and the destruction of the Greeks' champion, Achilles. Apollo became Hector's shadow. In the final, desperate battles for Troy, the sun god flew beside the Trojan prince, an invisible golden shield. He deflected spears, he breathed divine stamina into Hector's lungs, he shouted warnings in his mind. He made his chosen mortal untouchable. But the gods, even Apollo, are subservient to one force greater than themselves: destiny. On Olympus, Zeus brought out the golden scales. He placed the fate of Achilles on one side and the fate of Hector on the other. Slowly, Hector's side sank down toward the shadow of Hades. The decision was made. The universe had spoken. Zeus gave the order to his son: Apollo must stand down. Apollo, the god of prophecy, knew he could not fight the Moirai. In an act of profound divine grief, the golden god vanished from Hector's side. The shield was gone. Hector felt the divine protection leave him, replaced by a cold dread. He was hunted down by the rage-filled Achilles, and, abandoned by his patron god, Hector was slain. Apollo watched in horror. His grief turned to ice as Achilles, consumed by a brutal, chaotic rage that defied all civilized order, refused to honor the body. Achilles tied Hector to the back of his chariot and dragged his greatest foe in the dust, desecrating the body, refusing the sacred rites of burial. This was not war. This was a violation of the piety, order, and honor that Apollo himself championed. Achilles had committed the ultimate hubris. And Apollo, the god of vengeance, would answer. The sun god would not be defied by the fates. Hector was dead, yes. But Achilles, the agent of that chaos, would now pay the price. Apollo knew the Greek champion was invincible, dipped in the river Styx by his mother, the nymph Thetis. But Apollo, the god of truth, also knew the secret, the one mortal spot where Thetis's hand had held him. The heel. Apollo bided his time. He did not need strength, he needed an instrument. He found the perfect one, Paris. The prince of Troy, the lover who had stolen Helen, the coward who had started the entire war, was firing arrows desperately from the battlements of Troy. Paris loosed a bronze-tipped arrow, a wild shot of terror aimed at nothing. Apollo, invisible as the plague he carried, caught the arrow in midair. He did not just guide it, he became it. He imbued the shaft with his divine, infallible power, the same power that had executed the Python. He steered the arrow across the chaotic battlefield, past the roaring shields and the cries of soldiers. He guided it past the divine armor of Achilles, armor forged by Hephaestus himself. He piloted the shaft with the perfect, cold accuracy of a surgeon, striking the one tiny, unprotected mortal spot. The arrow plunged deep into the heel of Achilles. The greatest hero of the Greeks, the invincible demigod, the killer of Hector, froze. He looked down, shocked, seeing a coward's arrow protruding from his only weakness. He did not know that the shaft had been aimed and delivered by the sun god himself. Achilles, the unstoppable force of the Greeks, collapsed and died in the Trojan dust. The Greeks would eventually win the war, not by strength, but by the trick of the Trojan horse, sacking the city Apollo had tried to protect. But the victory was hollow. Their champion was dead. Apollo, the patron of the losing side, had claimed the final, most important victim. The war ended. The heroes turned to dust. The gods retreated from the mortal plane. All that remained were the constants. Artemis, having seen her justice served on Agamemnon at Aulis, had already returned to her forests, the humiliation on the battlefield only furthering her isolation. Apollo, his vengeance on Achilles complete, returned to the silence of Delphi. The Trojan War, the event that forced them into a reluctant alliance, was over. Now, their cold, permanent estrangement, born from the death of Orion, could truly begin. The Trojan War ended. The age of heroes burned away, its greatest champions, Hector and Achilles, both consumed by the vengeful plots of the gods. The dust settled on the ruined city of Troy, and the Olympians retreated from the mortal battlefield. The Great War, which had forced the divine twins into a reluctant, hostile alliance, was over. What remained was the new, permanent order of the cosmos. All that was left was the two constants, the two poles of divinity born from Leto, the sun and the moon. Their estrangement was now complete. The betrayal of Orion was a wound that immortality could not heal. The humiliation Artemis suffered at the hands of Hera on the plains of Troy, while her brother, allied to the same cause, was unable or unwilling to defend her, was the final confirmation. They were no longer family. They were rival forces, occupying the same sky but never the same space. Apollo returned to Delphi, his vengeance on Achilles complete. He resumed his role as the center of the civilized world. He is the god of the sun, the unwavering light of reason, clarity, and law. He is the god of the polis, the city, the public square. Mortals must travel to him, humble themselves at his temple, and receive the codified, structured will of Zeus. His is the music of the lyre, mathematical, perfect, and demanding of order. But his golden light casts a long, dark shadow. His civilization is built upon the skin of Marsyas, the ashes of the Cyclopes, the bodies of Niobe's sons, and the memory of the plague he unleashed. He is the god of harmony, but his justice is the cold, intellectual wrath of the executioner. Artemis returned to the wilderness. She is the goddess of the moon. She rejected the civilized centers, finding her sanctuary in the untamed mountains of Arcadia. She is the antithesis of the city. She is the sacred, primal boundary. Her domain is the wild, her law is instinct, and her subjects are the beasts and the maidens she protects. Her music is the silence of the forest, the snap of the twig, the cold whistle of the arrow that brings sudden, merciful death. She is the protector, but her justice, as Actaeon learned, is absolute, primal, and instant. She is the goddess of independence, isolated by her own vow, and hardened by the betrayals of her father, her brother, and her rival, Hera. Their versus dynamic was no longer a conflict, it was the balance of the world. Artemis rules the night, but the night sky itself is an eternal monument to her grief, a map of her family's betrayals. As she hunts, she must look up and see the constellations of Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the celestial forms of Callisto and Arcus, the victims of her father's lust and Hera's jealousy, the nymph she abandoned because her own heart had been hardened by betrayal. And highest in the winter sky, she must forever see him, Orion, the great hunter, the companion she placed among the stars herself. He is the constant, painful reminder of the friendship she lost and the calculating cruelty of her own twin brother. This is the final state of Apollo versus Artemis. They are the equal and opposite forces that govern the mortal plane. He is the sun, she is the moon. He is the structured law of the city, she is the intuitive freedom of the wild. He is the revealed truth of prophecy, she is the sacred mystery of the hunt. They are the divine twins, forever linked by the suffering of their birth, and forever separated by the choices of their divine lives. They are not at war. They simply are the eternal opposition that holds the universe in balance.